Well, good morning, everyone. I'm James Greengrass. I'm one of the partners here at Green Park. My particular area of interest is central government, the wider public sector, arm's length bodies, NDPBs, and the like. And I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you to Sir Trevor and to Raj for a very interesting session, particularly around the report. Some of those facts and figures are very interesting to listen to. But we're here now to discuss, does culture still eat strategy for breakfast, or is it perhaps the other way around? I'm fortunate to be joined by Rachel Cox, Chief People Officer of the Low Carbon Contract Company, LCCC, as we normally abbreviate it, and Lewis Coakley from London Fire Brigade, who's the Head of Culture and Organisational Development. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning, James.
Nice to see you both. So thank you for joining us today. It's party conference season, as I'm sure we're all aware, so very timely to be asking this, but we've all seen the glossy new strategies that organisations like to launch with a great fanfare behind them. But the day-to-day reality often looks quite unchanged for employees within organisations. So my first question to you is that because strategy rarely penetrates the systems, the processes, and the behaviours that actually shape culture? Meaning culture ends up being the true delivery mechanism, whether leaders like it or not. Rachel, perhaps I'll go to you first, your view.
Yeah, thank you, James. I think a really interesting topic. I was talking to our strategy director at work yesterday, and clearly he had a view on which one wins out, culture or strategy. But I think interesting. I thought, well, actually, I'll go where I would go with any big questions in preparing for today. So I went to AI and asked AI what they think, and they gave me a pretty good answer, actually, which was the reality is that an effective strategy without a positive culture is unlikely to be delivered successfully, but equally a really positive organizational culture and no strategy probably isn't going to deliver the great results either. So it is about a balance. But I guess in terms of your specific question, I think there's a risk, I think, with any kind of development of strategy that people bring with them a playbook from what they've seen before in another organization, in another sector, and assume that the conditions are similar. And I think without that really strong understanding of the culture, and like you said, presented in all the ways you described there, in the systems, the processes, the ways of working, how decisions are made, if you don't have the regard for that or the appreciation of that, there's a risk that you try and implement something that just won't land successfully. And I've seen that in my own career. And if I'm honest, I was probably a little bit guilty of that in moving into LCCC, in terms of there were some very big similarities to organizations I've worked in before. And I could have assumed that everything I've done before, oh, great, well, I know how this works. I'm just going to put that in place. And there's some really tangible things that were really different. So, for example, our organization is quite young, both in terms of when it was set up, but also our workforce is relatively young. It's a tech-driven organization. It's in that scale-up mode. But in my last organization, we used to have to TLDR everything. So that means too long didn't read, in case you didn't know. So basically make everything brief, really clear. If it's more than 3 bullet points, people won't read it. So I took that into this organization, and actually I work in an organization where everyone reads everything, and actually they love lots of detail. So again, that's just one example, but of where you risk bringing in, like you said, your playbook, how I think things work, your strategy from before. But if you don't really understand the organization and how it works, you risk having something that just doesn't land. So I guess that's my initial thoughts.
No, thank you. I do like TLDR. I should be implementing that immediately. Lewis, your view, please, sir.
I mean, it's interesting starting with the nature of the organisation. So London Fire Brigade, over 150 years old, 6,000 staff, lots of very long service. So some firefighters make it into 40 years, some up to 50 years in their career. So when you've got 103 fire stations spread all across London, what that means is culture isn't one thing that is easy to define. You get different cultures in every different part of the organisation. So you come in with a strategy at the top and say, this is the direction we want to go in. But if you don't try and think about how is this going to land in every one of our different fire stations, in every one of our different spaces and offices, then your strategy isn't going to land. So I think you have to, a bit like yourself, Rachel, I think you have to see both together. You can't see them as distinct and separate. You have to have a clear strategy about where you want to go, but you need to understand that culture is an outcome of systems and processes. And unless you try and understand that before you implement, then you probably won't get anywhere at all.
So, and many leadership teams, both clients particularly, I see, are very guilty or seem addicted to producing new strategies at pace, often before the last one appears to have been implemented. But how often do those strategies actually shift how people behave at work, do we think? Lewis, perhaps we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think this is really challenging. So we've got one major strategy at London Fire Brigade, which I think is 2023 to 2029. So that covers a very long period in time. About this the other day, two things that have happened in that period that weren't referenced in the original strategy. We've got the massive exponential rise in AI, and then we've got I think in 2022, 23 we saw massive wildfires. So and that wasn't something we had in our strategy. I think good strategy is adaptable and flexible to what is thrown at it, and I think that's what we try and create here. We create strategies that are adaptable, but I think you're absolutely right. If you're trying to create lasting change, you have to take into account what are the behaviors we're trying to change in this strategy, what are the systems we're trying to change in the strategy, and I think not this organization, but I look around and I think how many organizations really put time in the kind of strategic planning process to say, let's take a real hard look at budgeting, for example. Have we gone through our budgeting process and said, does this deliver the cultural outcomes that we're looking for? Or does your financial budgeting process always stay the same because no one ever thinks of culture and finance? The two things never really go together in people's minds. So should leaders stop obsessing about new strategies? No, I think you have to adapt and you have to change. But again, I always come back to the two things need to go together. You can't have an effective strategy if you don't think about the culture you're trying to create. And if you try and think about the culture you're trying to create without a positive vision of where you're going, that doesn't work either.
Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Lewis said there. I think, and just to kind of, I guess, pick up on the point around changing things will change that are outside of your control. So we have a 5-year strategy. We're actually just starting our 5-year strategy cycle right now. But there will be things that come along within that period that we have to pivot and adapt to. And that's where your culture comes in, because without the culture and the ability to pivot and adapt when things do come in, again, your strategy, well, it won't be worth the paper it's written on. So for example, we operate in the renewable space. Our mission is to accelerate the delivery of net zero. And we've seen how the changing situation in the US with Trump's election has had a huge impact on that industry, because, projects that had started and been invested in and had all of the permissions to go ahead were cancelled overnight, and the mood music has shifted entirely. And without getting too political, we can see.
Oh, no, we'd like some controversy.
We can see, increasing scrutiny over net zero, which previously had cross-party support. Now that could have a very significant impact on our organisation. And I think, like I said, seeing what happened in the US, you can see how overnight, organisations in that sector have had to pivot. So I think that's where, for me, that building that culture of flexibility, adaptability, the ability to recognize that change is a constant and the change is never done is really essential. And I think that's where we've tried to go in terms of defining our values, which we redefined last year, to make sure that people understand that we might have a great plan, but actually things will come along that will cause us to need to change it.
Yeah, and just following up, one of the challenges I'm sure you both face in probably different ways is politicians, be they local, be they regional, devolved government or central government, get elected on promises rather than necessarily strategies, without naming any names. Does that, if you're looking from an organizational perspective, does that change how you react to them as a client organization, as it were, in terms of thinking, okay, well, here comes the latest political wheeze, my words, not theirs. Is there not a natural tendency to plan for the short term rather than the mid and the long than perhaps business does? To either of you.
So let me try and answer it. So LFB is part of the GLA family. We're part of the Greater London Authority. So ultimately, the commissioner, my boss, is appointed by the mayor. So we are we're in that political environment. We get the top level, our strategic direction comes from the mayor, and what the mayor gets elected on feeds its way through our system. So I suppose we've existed like that for a very long time. So it's in our planning process, like how we respond to political changes in the GLA. That's all part of how we plan and how we prepare. It's in our strategic planning cycle. So I think I suppose you could argue it's become part of our culture in how we respond to those kind of things. And I think that just to go back a little bit, on the previous point, one of the things I wanted to say was, if sometimes you can see culture as a strength. So you talk about flexibility and how you adapt. I think if you look at an organisation as old as LFB, sometimes you can come in and say, oh, well, this is the culture we want. We need to throw everything out the window and start again. And I think you'll be on a fool's errand if you try and do that. I think lots of the time, I think you should start with a better question, which is, what do we look like at our best? What does this organisation look like when we're performing at our best? And that's what we did when we created our values recently. We asked staff that question, and what that gives you is, from a kind of appreciative inquiry approach, it tells you what our kind of our latent culture is like, and then that becomes your values, and then you're moving in a direction of strength rather than moving in a direction of away from something that you're trying to avoid. That's a kind of hopefully a way of avoiding the political question.
No, we're good. I think on the plus side, it made my experience of be it local government, devolved government, central government, is what it builds in its people functions, in its organizational structural leadership, is one, great resilience, but also amazing flexibility about having to adapt as situations can change quickly, which I don't think you do find in some parts, certainly of private sector. But if culture really does eat strategy for breakfast, maybe we're hiring the wrong kind of leaders. Is it therefore time to rethink leadership recruitment? We would say that at Green Park, wouldn't we? And development, and perhaps instead prioritise cultural change makers over strategists and policy experts. Rachel, do you want to have a go at this one first?
Yeah, my favourite topic.
Right.
Leadership capability is my team will well know. So I think LCCC, like a lot of organisations, has historically recruited and promoted for technical expertise. We've got amazing subject matter expertise in our organisation, and people are really willing to share their experience with you. I came from a completely different sector, and it's been a real learning curve, but the organisation has really helped me with that. But as I said, you know, a lot of our organisations do the same. You then risk having people in leadership roles, not only who haven't got necessarily the tools or the confidence to lead, but actually you've not made the expectations clear. And I think for me, that's kind of the first step, which is a lot of leaders and managers don't know what they don't know. So they actually don't know what you expect them to do. And I think a lot of HR people are guilty of then just going, the leaders are rubbish, the managers are rubbish, why don't they do what we tell them to do? But actually, oftentimes we haven't, as I said, really made it clear what they need to do. So for me, leadership development and recruitment starts with what is a leader in our context. Now, and that will look different in LCCC to London Fire Brigade, I'm sure, very different. And again, it comes back to not just kind of bringing in your playbook that worked elsewhere, because what a leader is in our organisation will look different, what we expect at different levels, what we expect day to day, and then navigating the culture and the environment that we're in. So I'm lucky actually that later today I'm launching our first manager development program covering all of our line managers in LCCC, which is the first program that we've run as a company of that kind. And that is about, like I said, setting those expectations, but then acknowledging that we haven't necessarily done enough in investing in those people in that area, and that we need to do that. I think the other thing for me, I would just say, is it's the Peter Drucker model of the LAF&T. So how you spend your day: leadership, admin, followership, and technical, which is kind of your functional expertise. I think without kind of giving managers and leaders the skills to empower and their teams, the risk they're just trying to add the leadership onto a full day, doing all of that other stuff. And I think, again, I've seen that in our organization. The day will never be long enough if you're trying to add on management and leadership onto all of the technical bit of your job, and you don't give any of that away. So I think that's a big part of our leadership development, is around where actually do I need to step away and trust my team to deliver, and giving people the skills and the confidence to do that.
Otherwise,
so I love what you're saying about setting realistic expectations. I think that's absolutely essential. We're basically doing the same, stepping back and saying, well, what do we actually expect our most senior leaders to be doing? What does that look like? What are those competencies? How can we articulate those clearly? And then once you set those expectations, you can hold people accountable for them. But far too often you try and hold people accountable without ever articulating what the expectation is in the first place. And then people can rightly turn around and say, well, hold on a second, I wasn't aware that I was meant to be doing all those things around visibility when I'm a really great technical expert. So I think the expectations piece is absolutely right. I was looking at some Gartner research that was published earlier this year. Apologies, different organization. And I think they were saying over 56% of business leaders acknowledge that leading change is part of their core responsibility, which I find absolutely fascinating, because I think setting strategy isn't, you don't end up coming to work and set strategy every day. There's a strategic planning process. You might set a vision, you might lock that in, and then you move towards it. So do I think you need a set of leaders who constantly are thinking about strategic direction? Maybe this is specific to me. I don't think we do, but I do think we need people who are thinking about what's the culture we're trying to create. Am I being clear about that? Have I set the expectation of the culture in this team or this unit or this business? And then how am I taking people on that journey? And I think that is something that increasingly leaders are going to have to pay attention to. It relates back to the points that Raj was making earlier on. If people aren't thinking about it, culture happens anyway, and you'll end up with a wrong culture. So I think you have to be deliberate about it, and I think and if you aren't paying attention to it, then I really, really think you should be.
Indeed. Just a comment from the audience that's timely and relates to this. Amanda makes the point of coming from the background of founding a charity, then running it for nearly 10 years. I can tell you this topic is dear to my heart. I do think there should be different recruitment, division of roles, and thoughtful input into the structure and remuneration. The visionary and drive behind a charity or organisation needs to be used for their strengths, and not spend time trying to do it all when it comes to leadership. Thank you, Amanda. If I put you on the spot, both of you, and said you only get one lever and you've got to pick and you've got to use it, that's going to change the culture of an organisation to ensure your respective parts of the public sector delivers better outcomes in the next decade. So we'll give you a while. I don't think you'd ever get a decade in reality, but let's go with that. Which lever would you choose and why? Rachel.
Okay, I'm not sure you'd describe it as a lever, but I'll give it a go anyway.
Are you going to change it into some kind of carbon capture?
Well, let's just see. Bear with me. So I would say, obviously, I mean, particularly in the public sector, clearly there is need for frameworks, consistency, rules and checks and balances around, managing public money. No brainer. Not going to find me arguing with that. And similarly, in any large organization, you need to have rules that dictate how things are done. But I guess without an appreciation of the particular organization, like you said, Lewis's context looks very different to mine. There's a risk that those rules end up actually not allowing people to make decisions that make sense on the ground. So for me, I believe in kind of freedom within a framework and treating people like grown-ups. So, here are the guardrails, here are the parameters within which you work, and then equip people with the skills to be able to do that. Because I think it's hard to create a culture of empowerment when everything is very rigidly set for you to operate in. And I think for me, I have this big kind of core belief that, and in my early career, I used to always talk about fairness and consistency, but actually consistency doesn't always drive fairness. Consistency actually can drive huge unfairness, because treating me the same as someone else could be entirely the wrong thing to do. And as I said, I think you can apply that to any large organization of any kind. But I would say that ability to recognize where actually things do need to be different at both an individual and a collective level is really important, and giving people who understand the organization, the organizational concept, the freedom to operate within a framework would be my wish.
Lewis?
So I'm going to cheat. So I'll make one assumption and then I'll answer the question. So the assumption I'll make is, so if the question is all about one lever to change the culture of an organization, the assumption I'm making is that you have a positive vision of what the culture should be in the first place. So if that's so, and that's all about being deliberate. Lots of organizations don't articulate that. Culture happens by accident. So I think if the assumption is you've already got that, then my answer is twofold. Sorry, I think you need to take into account the systems and the behaviors, so the people and the systems. So have you really thought about what are the individual behaviors that you want to change in order to move towards the culture? And then your levers there might be management training, leadership training, might be incentives like reward and remuneration and things like that. And then what are the other levers that you've got? So one of the big debates that goes on in lots of organizations at the moment is get people back to the office. So if the culture you're trying to create is about getting people back to the office, that isn't the outcome in and of itself. What are the systems that you have that will make that a desirable thing? So what's the positive culture you're trying to create in that space? So do you want a vibey office? Do you want a place where people collaborate? Do you want have you got lots of people who do a very technical job and don't need to talk to each other? So it's kind of very roundabout way of saying, know what you're trying to achieve, and then think about the systems that you have to get there, and then think about the behaviors that you need to line up in order to move you in that direction.
Comment again from the floor from Judah. Interesting to hear about culture of institutions that have workplaces that are spread across an area. I've seen the common thread to connect them, such as unionization, brother, sisterhood, common threats. Strategy/culture conflict often contributes to the artifacts, or I like artifacts, good example, that many new recruits connect with when they start with the organization. Comments to that?
From a fire perspective, I think so. I think we're talking about Edgar Schein's model of culture, so the iceberg, and the idea that the kind of the bottom of the iceberg, that's your artifacts, which are the unespoused things that go on, the underlying assumptions that are true in an organization that really shape culture. So in an organization like LFB, again 150 years old, there are loads of things that are assumed about how people work. That really shape culture at a very micro level, and I think they massively shape how people feel when they join. So, and I think you have to be cognizant of when you're moving into that. So I made a lot of assumptions when I joined LFB, and then when I got here, I was kind of like, oh, that's very different. My husband's father was a firefighter, and I talked to him about what it was like to be a firefighter in the Northeast, and it was very different in London. So I ultimately agree that the artifacts in an organization can really shape things on a very local level.
Good. And what would be the single most practical step leaders could take tomorrow to make those changes effective? Perhaps Lewis, start with you on this one.
So I think culture in all our organizations happens whether you shape it or not. So I think tomorrow, making the choice to be deliberate about what culture you want to create is the most practical step. Because if you think about thoughts lead to actions, actions repeated lead to habits, habits become behaviors over time. Like if you follow that kind of pattern, then just having the thought that tomorrow I'm going to really think about the culture I want to create in my team, my organization, that's the most practical thing you can do. You'll start the journey.
Rachel?
Can I say what he said? I really like Lewis's answer.
Yeah,
I guess it would be a build on that, which is listen and don't assume. Listen to your people, listen to what your people are telling you, listen without, I guess, your biases, your own views of the world. You're trying to remove those as much as possible and really understand the environment that you're in, rather than, look at it through your own lens and as far as possible. I think in our organization, we're very different. We're 11 years old, not 100 plus years old. And, we have really recognized the need to do that in a more structured way, as we are now a bigger company. We're circa 300 people, very different to London Fire Brigade. But I think how you listen will look different in different organizations, and you'll need to put some more structures around that as you get bigger. But whatever that looks like in your organization, do that, and like I said, and try to not let your own biases or your own judgments get in the way of what that's telling you.
Okay, thank you. Another comment from the audience I'll read and perhaps get both of your reactions to. This is from Stephen. Good morning all. Thanks for this brilliant discussion. Thank you, Stephen. You're now my favourite audience member. The adaptability theme is spot on in this sector and more broadly in the private sector. Every shift in strategy requires a shift in culture at some level, and this challenges the traditional models of transformation that suggest there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, a change program that rolls out. We're in a world of constant evolution that requires always on culture intelligence flowing into the system and a far more agile, adaptive approach to supporting ongoing change. And delivery at every level. Such a key challenge for organisation. Thank you, Stephen. Excellent comment. Panel, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think any organisation that is thinking about, going back to our subject about what do we need from our leaders, who doesn't have change capability as part of their leadership recruitment development, needs to absolutely think about that. Because there's a risk that the change is seen as a discrete exercise, the restructure, the transformation program. We're done now. We can all go back to business as usual. I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is there is no business as usual, and the change is never done. So I completely agree. I think building that capability at a leadership level, but then also making sure that you help your people to navigate that change and give them, again, the tools and the confidence to do that is absolutely key. Because I don't think there's any organisation in any sector who could predictably say that what the next 5-10 years are going to look like. Certainly I've not worked in that organisation if it does exist.
Lovely. Lewis?
Thank you for the question, Steph. I think, so being controversial, I think there's a major difference between change practitioners in an organization who often work in a kind of PMO type background versus organizational development practitioners who I think work in a very different kind of way. I think one is more emergent and deliberative and dialogic. One is more input, process, output. And I think kind of your traditional change managers are great for I know you're going to build a railway, so like how's it going to work? Whereas when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with culture change, I think what you need is people who deal with change in a very different way. So that was my kind of thought on that.
Thank you. And Steph, apologies, you are Steph, not Stephen. It was abbreviated, but my apologies nonetheless. Point from Joanna that, again, linked to previous points. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, but systems eat culture for lunch. I think this aligns to the great insights we are hearing on the call. Possibly now my favourite audience member, Joanna. The right systems, tools and values need to be in place to allow culture to thrive. And this links to, there was a very interesting article, I think, last week from Michael about the always-on culture, with AI probably promoting the continual tearing down of more and more boundaries of what we used to have between work and rest of life, checking the emails constantly, LinkedIn, notifications, updates. Have either or both of you seen major impacts in those sense from systems and how they've impacted on culture?
So one thing we were criticised for at LFB in our culture review was the institutional effect of discrimination when women firefighters weren't able to get access to the same PPE. So the outcome there, we won't go into the kind of the whys and the hows, but
Don't
ultimately,
mention PPE today for it.
so the outcome of that was women firefighters weren't able to get the kind of access to their equipment as often as men firefighters, and so that is discrimination. It's an adverse outcome. So that for me is a kind of, it's a good example of where a system impacts culture. So when women weren't able to fight fires as often as men, and I don't think anyone designed the system to be like that, but for a variety of reasons, it ended up like that. And then once we found that out, we addressed it, and that was totally unacceptable. And then we started looking at, well, what are the problems? Well, actually, there are certain sizes we don't stock enough of, so we need to get more sizes. We need to make sure there's more availability. But that for me is to kind of to build on the question about systems eating culture for lunch, then that is exactly how you need to think about all of your systems. What's the impact of this system on uniform and PPE? And what outcome is it having? What's the culture for different groups? Again, building on what Raj was saying earlier on, and different people experiencing different things in the workplace. And do we have a culture that is desirable or not? And in that case, it wasn't, but we're moving towards major improvements in that place. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.
No, thank you. Rachel, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think I was just reflecting on something that Louise just said prompted the thought about. I think there are signature moments in your culture, signature moments to go, this decision, this handling, and it could be quite a small situation that show an organization that you're shifting. And I'm going to give a really small example, but as I said, in our organization, we have a lot of people who, like I said, they like detail and they like clarity, and they will read the whole policy and the whole communication in great detail. And recently there were tube strikes in London, and I was asked by various people in the organisation, when are you going to communicate about the tube strikes? And I said, well, what do you want me to say? And internal communication sits in my team. And I said, well, what would a communication say? What is it that you're wanting? It's in the public domain. Everyone can see that there are tube strikes. Well, in terms of, we have a 2-day week in the office policy. What will we do that week when there are tube strikes? And I said, well, what do you want in that communication? Well, what are we supposed to do? And I said, well, you're grown-ups. I trust you. If you can get to work, do it. If you can work from home, great. Now, clearly in Lewis's environment, there are roles that can't be done from home. But in our organisation, there are no roles that can't be done from home. And therefore, and we were under some pressure from various quarters and my team, and I kept saying, hold firm. These are the moments that help to shift a culture, because I want to treat you like grown-ups. And to do that, I'm not going to tell you exactly what you need to do that week. And again, because where I live and where you live is different. I might be able to walk to work, you may not. And so I think it's really important also to recognize that sometimes very small things, these, like I said, these signature moments help to shift a culture. And hopefully the lack of tube strike comms was one of those.
I can just say I really love that. I love the idea that kind of force people to sit with the discomfort. So it's really rubbing up against them. They want the answer. They want total clarity. And you're saying we're on this journey. We're moving towards this new place. And I think that's a really good habit for lots of us to get into, is to sit with the discomfort and then make sense of it and figure out where we need to go after. I love that.
Brilliant, thank you. I think one last question from the floor before we wrap up, and it's a point from Zach. And Zach says, surely an organization's current culture is the right one to produce the results it's currently achieving. If it wants to achieve something different, its culture will need to change to enable that. Question. How do we feel about that?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's what and how. Your strategy is what you're here to deliver. Your culture will enable the delivery of it. And that's why I think we talked about artifacts. you know, when you have a, you know, your vision, mission, strategy, if your values and your culture sit separately over here, then it won't, like, it absolutely won't deliver that. So for me, the way I've always positioned kind of the, like I said, whichever terminology you use in an organization, but your company values, if your values are not directly linked to, we will deliver our strategy by and through this, then they will just be seen as two separate things. Or worst, in the case of values, what I used to call mouse mat values, which is a reference that really ages me, but
yes,
values
no, unfortunately, I understand very well, Rachel.
yeah, values that you got your mouse mat on your screensaver, but actually don't really resonate, don't really describe the culture or really have a meaningful impact on people's day-to-day work. So for me, the two absolutely have to be integrated, and people need to understand how they're integrated, because, like you said, otherwise one cannot deliver the other.
I'm really mulling this one over, and I can't really tell what I think about it. I'm sat here thinking we're 150 years old, and our culture is, we've got a set of values, and they're kind of driving us in the direction that we want to go in terms of the culture we're trying to create. But ultimately, we have lots of mini cultures, microcultures everywhere, and we're on a journey. Do I think that we've got exactly the culture I want to have everywhere, in every fire station, in every part of the business? Do I think I've got that today? No. So, but are we putting out fires at the right pace? Are we doing what we need to do? Yes, I think we are. So, yeah, this was a tricky one for me. I'm not entirely sure how I'd come at it. A really good question. You definitely stumped me on this. I'm not quite sure why.
No, it's a good question. Well, thank you both. We're out of time now for this session. Thank you to everyone in the audience who's been sending questions in. I'm sorry I haven't been able to keep up with all of them. I may try and feed some of those into some of the later sessions and see if we can pick up them, because they are organisationally neutral. Culture and strategy, I guess, being to sector agnostic terms. But Lewis, thank you very much. Rachel, thank you very much. It's been fabulous to see you both. Thank you for all your contributions. We're now going to take another short break, probably about 5 minutes this time. Next up, we'll be exploring the question of, is development of future skills now an organisational imperative, with Winmark and the CIPD. Thank you all. Have super days. Take care. Bye-bye.